All right, so good morning to the early bird session. So my talk this morning, accompanied by breakfast, is about how AlphaSense powers smarter competitive intelligence of market intelligence. We kind of use the same, we use them interchangeably, essentially. And today's agenda, we wanted to bring essentially two things. One, talk a little bit about what we see about competitive intelligence, and sort of do a little bit of a contrast on what's the ambition and what do we see in reality, and how do we see AI and AlphaSense influencing this for the better. And this is the agenda. The reality, looking at signals, AI's role in the change in the strategy, and then essentially let's land with AlphaSense a little bit and see how we approach this problem, and finish with a short demonstration just to give you a little bit of a sense of like how we think and solve for some of those issues. So first things first, I wasn't quite sure how many people would be here, but I thought, Dennis, I knew you were coming, so I thought maybe it would be a one-on-one with you. But it's nice to see additional people here. So perhaps I can just introduce myself a little bit and be really great to understand who's in the room. And I wanted to talk a little bit with you guys around, like, what do you guys see as the role of competitive intelligence or market intelligence for your organizations in an ideal case? But before we get into that, just a brief introduction for myself. My name is Michael Bommers. You might sense the accent's not properly English, so I'm actually German, grew up near Dortmund, but have been living in London for a while, and I oversee our efforts in the DACH region within manufacturing in the DACH region for AlphaSense, and I've been doing that for close to 3 years. And part of today's presentation will be bringing also my personal impressions of what I've learned in those close to 3 years. So not everything is totally based on research and presentations by consultancy firms, but also a little bit of what I see on my day-to-day in the last few years. But yeah, so do you guys mind just like letting me know who you are and what firms you work for?
I'm from Hitachi Energy.
Yeah.
The market intelligence department. We do have AlphaSense, but it stays with the strategy team.
Yeah.
So I'm super curious to understand what the others see.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
My name is Lena from BASF, one of the ODs, and their corporate technology or corporate unit is using AlphaSense.
Yeah.
The ODs itself only limited, so
Yeah.
that's also why I'm very interested.
All right, cool. Good to know. Thank you. I know you guys already. But if you want to introduce yourself for the rest of them, that's also fine. Thanks, Christian.
Okay, then I will continue. My name is Dennis Kienberger. I'm the head of global market intelligence, also working for Shop. And I used to work with AlphaSense with my former employer. So I'm a bit of a fan, so to say. This is also why we had a longer session yesterday to check out your system with my current position and our current competitive environment, how this is working. And you also asked about the ambition. Of course, also our ambition is to know as much as possible about our competitors, or the ones that are publicly listed. It's obviously easier compared to the ones that are not listed, and the smaller the companies get, the more difficult it becomes to get information. And curious to also learn a bit more from your approach at AlphaSense.
Thank you. At the back, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Yes?
Yeah.
Cool.
My name is Benjamin Schmidt. I'm coming from the company Spreader in France. I'm part of the business development team. We are looking for two new developers of the market intelligence, starting, analyze, and that's why AlphaSense
Could you speak up a little bit? I can only just hear about every fourth word.
morning for me.
Yeah, me too.
I'm part of the business development team,
Okay.
and we are looking for a tool that will help us with the market intelligence, not only finding information, but also analyzing it. So we can spend a lot of time in the selection of the news, relevant news, and so on. So AlphaSense could be one of the providers.
Thank you. Madam, you.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Ingrid Zander. I'm working at Cimicon. It's a German company, but we are actually international based everywhere. I'm living in France. I'm leading marketing health, but I'm doing as well competitive health all around, insights and so on. And I'm simply interested. We have home-made marketing health application and data architecture. As I'm as well software engineer, I can do it, but it's nice if there are no dependence on one person. It's not so nice from work application.
Understood, thank you. Yes.
Hello, I'm Zsuzsa Fürk. I am coming from Denmark, from a plant producer called Grundfos.
Ah.
I am part of group strategy, and my main task is competitor monitoring and analyzing competitor rules and market sizing. We are working with different projects for different divisions in our company. And my main purpose was actually to see how other companies are doing market intelligence. We already have access to different companies, and we are partnering with different companies with research for us, and also we have with Comically the platform where we are monitoring. But the aim is to become better and better, and actually to see how others are doing it. This was very interesting. They yesterday, I'm sure you will.
Thank you. I've made some notes here, so I'll try to bring all this somewhere into the talk track later, but thank you, appreciate it.
I'm Sophia Rex, so Chef's Experience, who also has software in-house, and our magazine illustrates you, and from Shakespeare, of course, is from the same part, our story, and what's your vision about this?
Okay, thank you. All right. First of all, it's a pleasant surprise there are more people here than we had anticipated, which is nice. So, as it reads on the slides, like, what's the ambition versus the reality? And I just wanted to have a discussion around if you guys had to describe the function and the value add that market intelligence brings to your organizations or any other organizations. It's sometimes easier to decouple yourself from your day-to-day because there's obviously certain restraints. But like, in a nutshell, what would you say that market intelligence is meant to bring to any organization? Like, what are some of the high-level notes that it has, and what does it drive for the organization? Not everyone at once. Like some people said, we cover our competition. Some people mentioned, we want to monitor the news. Is there anything else that you say in an ideal case, like CI or MI should bring to the table?
I think for us, it's also that it can really derive strategic actions, not only spending time on collecting everything, analyzing, but really going to what is it that we can take out of it.
Yeah. So it's not just collection, but also interpretation, and then also providing some guidance. Yeah. And who does that guidance go to?
Mostly leadership, but also depending on organization, how it is spread.
Yeah.
Maybe also some other persons in sales team, whoever.
Okay. So various stakeholders, but basically leadership in the front line, both sides, right? Okay. Cool. Anyone else that thinks it should be different or wants to add to that? I think your hand was up earlier.
Yeah, generally in my company, I'm speaking often to board members,
Yeah.
especially where the markets are going and the biggest competitors and the rising competitors. It's really, and I'm not covering only our markets, I'm covering markets before, means raw material, we have production, and B2C. And therefore, if they move on one of the other markets that are the early sides,
Okay, so if I understood that correctly, you're saying, one, beyond the collection, you're trying to work with various stakeholders, whether they're, again, similar to their like leadership, frontline, sales, etc., but also trying to predict moves, not just sort of like, processing what has already happened. So forward-looking.
What happened is, okay to know,
Yeah.
probably to explain why we're doing moves or not,
Mm-hmm.
but I want to help predict pricing, predict who makes the moves, predict market.
Okay. Anyone else want to contribute towards this? No? Okay, so I think we covered a lot there. So I also thought about this, and what we tend to hear is that we want to continuously monitor the market. That includes players, products, pricing, and any sort of go-to-market moves, which I think speaks a little bit to what you were saying around like what's coming up in the future. One thing that hasn't been mentioned in this group, but what we often hear is that there's a need to collect diverse perspectives. So do you have an over-reliance on one particular source? Yes or no? Probably not good. You want to sort of make sure that you eliminate over-reliance and blind spots and try to diversify and also de-risk your collection of information. Proactive creation of scenarios and modeling of situations. That's exactly what was mentioned by a few of you is, we collect information, yes, sure, fine, that's the starting point, but actually, like, what do we do with it? How do we sort of interpret that with our knowledge of the domain that we work in? And how do we arm people in the right places of the organization to take action with that? And then, sort of closely related to that, this idea of market intelligence, whether that's, I know, Dennis, you work at a corporate level, I know that you have like various business units to support, but then again, this idea that, someone in a market intelligence function is actually an asset to other parts of the organization by collaborating closely with them and with a strategic mindset. So all in all, I think this is sort of like some of the key things we see. Of course, every company is a little bit different. Everyone does it slightly differently. So we're sort of trying to capture sort of some key themes here. Now, and this is mainly my observation as someone, I did sort of the math yesterday of about 800 meetings on an annual basis, 4 a day, 5 times a week. So there's a lot of things that we hear and see. And actually, there are some companies that do it really well, and this is going to be slightly provocative, right? So I'm just saying this as a heads up. But a lot of companies basically tell me, yeah, we're fine, we're covering the basics, and there's no over-reliance on what's publicly available without having to pay for it, right? So that's one thing. And then they talk about news alerts, scrolling news. We've built a web scraper ourselves in-house with the IT team, and it does an okay job, is what I often hear. Newsletters, for a lot of companies, are a key deliverable, and they will spend significant portions of their budgets on newsletter tools that will curate for different consumers within the organization a newsletter which essentially processes what's already happened, and then, okay, we're doing 50 newsletters for 10 user groups, etc. But then what I sort of often ask myself is, so what? Like, what do they do with those newsletters? Like, how do you measure your success based on that? Another thing is, one example of this is, projects that are done annually, like a battle card. Who's our competition? What are their products? How do we win against them? How do we arm sales with it? The problem is that oftentimes these things are done once or twice a year. You can imagine that if you do it once a year, in the worst case, there's 365 days where things can change and you don't reflect that update. So there's clearly a gap. And then in some instances, you have also similar to the battle card topic, you have your set menu. These are the things we're going to do this year. And it includes a laundry list of projects, such as we do a quarterly review of these 10 competitors, and it's static. Like, I think someone mentioned over there in the room, who are the competitors we don't know yet? Like, who are the ones that are insurging into our market? Who are the ones coming to take our market share there, tend to be more innovative? Like, those sort of set lists of reports tend to not tailor for that, not allow the flexibility to cover those sorts of situations, which exposes companies to a little bit of risk in that sense. Is there anything on here, or is there anything else that you guys in the room think is missing in sort of some of the reality that some companies live? I guess that's a no. All right. So yeah, and then the focus that we have sort of like alluded to a few times in the room is this idea that it's very reactive, right? We report things that have already happened rather than trying to look into the future. And I know that to a degree, some of this reporting what happened in the past is the starting point, but oftentimes you can work from that and try to derive signals. Like you see repetitive moves, for example, if you think, I speak to a lot of automotive players, and they're sort of saying, okay, what are the Chinese doing? Where are they building their factories? Like, which partnerships are they establishing? And whilst that is reporting what's happened in the past, you can start to see a pattern of like, slow encroachment into the European market, into internationalization, into production outside of China, for example. And those things are signals that, okay, someone's coming into the market, we need to get ready for this and take action and then provide strategic guidance. But yeah, so those are some of the observations. And if you then contrast those two things, like what we described as the ideal state versus the common reality, we see that sometimes those gaps are essentially a business risk. So we talked about, do we continue things on an ongoing basis versus annually or quarterly? Well, if you do it on an annual basis or quarterly basis, that might impact the decision making, the dynamism of that. So, and it might allow other rivals who are faster, more innovative, to set the narrative and potentially make moves before you do, and then it might be too late. And well, the outcomes of that depend on the company, it depends on your market, it depends on the barriers, but oftentimes it's not a good thing. Having diverse sources versus relying on predominantly things that aren't expensive or even free. I think it's pretty obvious, I mentioned it earlier, right? This exposure to blind spots, and you don't know what you don't know. So that in itself is a risk, and most companies try to offset that risk by making some investments into tools. A lot of them are here today. We are here now. So yeah, proactive scenario modeling versus reactive. Essentially, you're missing your window of opportunity to act and have a positive outcome for the organization. And then this idea that this is sort of speaking to the last point on like the set list or for your set part of the business. Some companies just do this, like from what they call the lighthouse, right? Sort of, you just send some newsletters here and there, and then nothing happens with it. So you're probably limiting the ability to inform and be a strategic thought partner to some important parts of the business if you do it that way, rather than having a real relationship with leadership. I think the board was mentioned as one of them. The sales leadership was mentioned. If you remove those silos and don't just say, right, we're doing these 10 newsletters every other week, we're sending something, and then that's it, job done, go home. There's obviously a little bit more that you can do to actually drive the success of the organization. So those are some of the gaps that we observe, and I said this is meant to be a little bit provocative. So what are we observing from firms that are doing a little bit better? Well, and this is just not talking about AlphaSense, but like AI in general. We sort of like, used to say that, AI will give you an edge, but actually some of the organizations we speak with now, and what I'm observing is that actually if you're not using AI in many parts of the organization, you're already behind. It's no longer something that gives you a massive advantage, but everyone has it now. So it's a matter of keeping up to a certain degree. So we see that 76% of organizations that are considered leaders use AI in some part of their business, probably in multiple. We're hearing from lots of companies about integrations and combining different tools into workflows. This is something that also Deloitte sees across 92% of leading organizations. Then, this is again a personal observation that I tried to back up with data. Lots of firms try to build internally. You appoint a new CIO or CTO, and he will come with a mandate and trying to sort of make an impression and make his mark on the organization, and will kick off an AI project. What does that mean? Well, very often it means SharePoint in combination with Copilot, and then providing some sort of like overlay with agentic workflows. And essentially, that's half the companies that don't buy off the shelf, but try to develop in-house. Can be good, but what you often risk is, and we'll hopefully make this point later, is that it has to be almost like a one-size-fits-all, so it's not specific to one user group within the organization, but has to cater to many needs, and then oftentimes becomes a little bit watered down. And yeah, and then there's an impression of myself, as you can see there with the reference, but there's an over-reliance on still processing things that have already happened, and perhaps there can be more of a focus of trying to take those signals and then provide future action. So why does closing this gap matter now more than ever? Well, we're seeing essentially the markets are becoming very violent. Like things are changing quickly, and like I see it like in the news as well by looking at some of the customers that I'm working with. People are shifting strategy, factories are being closed, and organizations from Asia and the US are being very aggressive into market entries, which essentially means that you have to stay nimble and the speed of execution becomes essential. There's macro uncertainty more than ever, one could argue. Inflation, supply chain shocks, and many other things that are happening that basically make keeping an eye on the market something that is very, very essential and being, very nimble and react to the changes in front of you. And there's productivity pressure. So everyone's talking about how can we do more or less, and again, the adopters of AI report anywhere between 15 and 30% of productivity gains, and it's in every consultant's playbook that goes to speak to management boards on how to increase your ROI on your people and your systems. So again, another pressure that makes this adoption and closing gaps very important. And for many organizations I speak with, budgets are flat. So essentially, like what you spent this year and next year might be exactly the same, even though there is inflation. So technically, things cost more, but so you have a bit of a bottom to the race. And what it oftentimes manifests is, you can't grow your team, even though you'd like to hire extra resources, or you can't buy the tools that you want, so you have to sort of make decisions around like what do I absolutely need to have versus this would be very nice to have, but I can't have it. So these are some of the pressures that I think AI in many instances helps alleviate, because essentially if you can do more with the same amount of people, that tends to be something that organizations can justify. Right, so how can AI tools like AlphaSense help? And I deliberately don't want to start with just talking about AlphaSense, but also AI more in general, and the benefits that it brings. So I did a little bit of research myself here, and the numbers are pretty compelling. So a study by MIT and Stanford suggests that knowledge workers can achieve a productivity gain of about 15% when it comes to tasks that are somewhat low or medium value, right? So I think the study was actually about call center workers and how successfully can they close conversations with a positive outcome. So using AI agents, funneling systems, etc., 15% productivity gain. Great. McKinsey study about certain companies and looking into their top-line production, up to 15% of revenue growth versus non-AI adopters, 20% ROI superior in terms of sales functionality from organizations that leverage AI tools deliberately. And BCG says, well, very similar to what McKinsey says, revenue growth of AI leaders versus non-adopters is 1.3x, so 30% higher. Very interesting. So that seems pretty compelling and very positive, but nonetheless, the same study suggests that 74% of companies fail to really extract a significant ROI from their AI strategies. Which begs the question, why? Well, this study seems to suggest it's actually the people that cause this shortfall, that it's the adoption by the humans that don't want to adapt to new ways. And I personally would also argue that if you look at some of the board-level materials that I've sort of read and seen and studied, is that the corporate agenda always has, we need AI, and it's very vague. It's nothing quite specific around, this is the team, this is the AI tooling, this is the use case. And I suppose that's where you have to ground the return on investment, is the actual application, and see exactly how you want to extract the value from that. So if we switch this over and compare that with statistics that we've pulled from our website, which showcase some of our case studies of customers from AlphaSense, there's a really good wealth of information they report on the benefits they get from AlphaSense. So up to 75% less time invested on information gathering, which in the flip side frees up time for analysis, providing scenarios and all these things. Another customer said that since they introduced agentic processing of certain key information, instead of doing it manually, they've been able to produce 120 times more intelligence assets. And these are either briefings to different stakeholders in the organizations, that's writing analysis on certain competition, et cetera, et cetera. So where there was one asset, now there's 120 on a quarterly basis, which begs the question, is this too much, is it too little? But essentially, it's been possible, which previously wasn't. And it's been unlocked by, in this case, AlphaSense. This one's interesting. Someone saves $70,000 a year on not hiring consultants to produce a study, to produce something. And I think this is interesting for one particular reason. When we, and Scott does the same, when we speak to customers or soon-to-be customers, you often ask the question of like, how do you manage to make a business case for an investment of this size? AlphaSense will have to vary in prices, et cetera. But usually what we hear is it has to make me money, has to save me money, or it has to help me mitigate serious risks, and it has to be hopefully more than one of these things. So if you can point to savings right away from the implementation of a tool, in this case, $70K for one person who used to hire consultants, and I'm not exactly sure what he was hiring them for, but that's good, right? That's exactly what leadership wants to see, is that we make an investment into a tool, into an asset, and it returns, in this case, a saving. Yeah, and then the other ones, just to round them up, is, again, an increase of intelligence assets created with AlphaSense versus prior by summarizing, synthesizing lots of information. The amount of outputs produced by one full-time equivalent has gone up by 33% in the instance of this customer. And then other organizations were also speaking about the fact that they can, and this speaks to the flat budgets, right? I have to hire approximately 5 people less in the future to produce the same amount of output as I do right now, or that's in the plan. So again, a lot of these data points point at the direction of higher efficiency, but behind it is also hopefully the point that you free up time for more important things, like looking into scenario building, informing some key stakeholders, maybe doing some more ad hoc requests that come from the organizations rather than working off the set list. So yeah. And here are some of the testimonials, and they basically say what I've just explained in the previous slide. So yeah, so we have some pretty happy customers, which is nice to see. And I want to come back to the point I made earlier on, and now bring it back to AlphaSense. We said 75% or 74% of companies don't achieve a significant ROI from their investment into AI. And I alluded to the point that I think also it's not specific enough. So AlphaSense, to sort of bring this home to this audience, which sounds is fairly relevant, is a company that is developing an end-to-end intelligence tool that is actually grounded in use cases and deliverables. So if we look at the right-hand side, we now start with the end in mind and thinking, okay, what is it that each of you produces? Is it a presentation? Is it a report? And these use cases are genuinely cover a significant portion of the to-do list that many people in strategy and market intelligence have. It's competitive landscaping, information retrieval, benchmarking, forecasting, etc. And ignore the middle part for just a second, because these are purpose-built tools that live within AlphaSense, and we ground the information and the answer in our content library that consists, it says 450 million here, but actually it's closer to 600 now. 600 million documents that come from broker reports, from a database of expert calls that have been led between customers and market specialists. It covers company documents, patents, financial data, private company profiling. So basically harvest over 20,000 premium sources to provide you with a very solid foundation to answer certain questions that are of strategic nature. And you can enrich it with your own perspective of, essentially connect some SharePoint folders is what I often hear. But I think many companies have a similar saying: if company X knew what company X knew, then you answer a lot of questions, and it speaks to the underutilization of your internal assets, and we recognize that. So AlphaSense now basically very much promotes this idea of compare your perspective with the external perspective, and you can bring it into this sort of workflow end-to-end with purpose-built AI. And I want to round this off with a demonstration. So I wasn't quite sure what audience we would have, so I thought I'd choose something that I know and most people know, so cars is something that I picked. And I want to show you through a little bit of a workflow that starts with asking a general question, go into more specifics, and then end up producing a deliverable that is fairly specific and ready to submit to a key stakeholder, and do that hopefully in minutes rather than what used to take hours or days even. With that in mind, let me just do a switch. Hopefully this is smooth. Yes, cool. So perhaps just a little bit of a, is this big enough? Yes, it is, okay. Just a little bit of a house tour. So AlphaSense, on the left-hand side, there's many different applications. I am not gonna use like all of them. In fact, I'm gonna use very few just to show you a couple of things to entice your interest. So right now, we are here in the section of AlphaSense where you can ask questions, open-ended questions, specific questions, whatever you like. So I can ask the question, what are the most recent innovations in autonomous driving, and who are the leading players? So what currently happens behind the scenes is that AlphaSense uses many large language models, and basically we have spent over 10 years training these planning agents to break down questions, interpret them, essentially deduct the intent of the question, dig deeper, go through, in this case, let me just try to zoom in a little bit. Won't let me zoom, okay. 32,000 documents, and it's now providing a response to the question. The industry experiencing rapid innovation, consolidated with significant enhancements in both technology and market positioning, etc. Talking through some of the players, BYD, XPeng, so some of the Asian players. And you can see here that actually it's citing a report that is seemingly interesting because it highlights some of the developments and investments, and this is coming from a broker out of Asia. And it's talking about some of the chips that are making autonomous driving more efficient possible, and everyone talks about the different levels. So what I could do here, essentially, when I want to talk over this, is the fact that we can go from taking a part of the response, clicking on it and verifying exactly where it's come from and reading into more context. So that's something that historically hasn't been super easy, because you get AI agents like Copilot telling you, here's the answer, but oftentimes it lacks the context. And especially if the answer surprises you, the majority of people I speak with want to see, where's this come from? Can I check it? Am I sure before I present this to someone in the organization? Because at the end of this day, it's your reputation as well, right? If you put your name next to it as the market intelligence leader, then you want to build a bit of a reputation in the organization as someone who knows what they're talking about and then does their homework and checks things. So this allows you to do this very quickly. It is also possible then to dive deeper into this report and ask questions. Just for the sake of today's time, I'm going to skip that, so that's something that is definitely possible. And if we think about the workflow, so we've asked a very open-ended question here, we're getting some insights, we're getting information about the leading players, and it's giving you all this data that provides you with further food for thought. So what then often might happen in a sort of day-to-day workflow is that someone will say, okay, fine, we've gone high level, let's get a little bit more specific. There seems to be something here that speaks about the players and the adopters of this coming from mostly the Asian region. So some of the players that were mentioned were the manufacturer NIO, the company Tesla, and I know Volkswagen is also investing a lot of this. So let's see how these different organizations discuss this topic. So I can essentially select up here, and I've now switched over to a bottom-up build of like what are the firms, what are the keywords, what are the sources, and basically setting my parameters. And I want to look at how do they talk about this to their investors. So I'm going to go and just say, right, I want to look back 90 days, and I want to look at like some of the things they discuss in their earnings calls. And this gives me 3 documents. Now, I'm going to take these 3 documents, and I want to have a bit of a conversation with these documents to see what it is they're telling me. And it essentially presents me with 2 options. I'm going to create a workspace. And many organizations tell me this is sort of the way they're going, is that they have different verticals, different topics, different end consumers in their orgs, and they want to have some specificity around the information they find. So I can ask about what are these firms saying about innovation and autonomous driving. and see how they talk about it, because the report suggests that Neo is adopting some of these chips to really drive innovation and have the next level of ADAS. I know this is quite specific to this one case and not necessarily relevant to everyone in the room, but it speaks to this idea of high level to specificity. And I want to just see, like, how do they compared to other people or other firms rather in the market. And now, again, AlphaSense using purpose-built large language models will break down this question again and give me just a high-level view of this is what Tesla's doing, and this is exactly what they're saying in their earnings call versus Volkswagen versus Neo. And essentially, we can now just chat with the data and say, please compare and contrast who's leading, who's lagging, who's investing more or less into this, and really start to get answers to question very, very quickly and in a way that isn't too complicated. Now, what this might then lead to is some insights, some notes, and essentially, like, how do we create this into a deliverable? Well, you can essentially just copy this into a notebook or create a PDF from it and start doing that. But we are sort of moving in a different direction with AlphaSense. You know, we're investing a lot into this idea of agentic workflows. So if you, let's say, had a watch list of your most important competitors, what are the things that you're doing to analyze these competitors? And we can essentially just build up a profile of these individual firms, which will cover both quantitative and qualitative information, but the idea that you know, produce something at the click of a button that used to take you maybe half a day and it takes you now 5 minutes, and it's of a high quality, is something that's quite appealing. So what I wanted to do is essentially, I figured out, okay, this company Neo is making some waves. Like, what's their positioning in the market? And essentially, I can just simply click on any of these different agents and create a SWOT analysis, a company primer, a company slide that can even be enriched by your own template so it looks and feels like your company's presentations. And essentially the choices are pretty broad, and it is our ambition to also make this slightly more flexible and that you can sort of reprompt this. But for now, you can essentially click on this, and it creates this output, which then looks into key takeaways, the battery technology, how they're competing and basically replacing BMW, Audi, and Mercedes in the Chinese market, which is the fastest growing market for that specific field. It talks about them essentially positioning themselves in the premium part, also competing with Tesla as a benchmark. It talks about their competition, how they compete with them and at what level and at what segment. And it's citing reports from banks and expert calls as a source of information. Again, these are content sets that are historically very, very difficult to use and process. And our interpretation is that they're very valuable. So you can see all these different things. It creates a table for you, and you could essentially just take all this information, read it, understand it, maybe change it a little bit, and then eventually just download it as a PDF, which looks like so, and send it to whoever your stakeholder is. And then hopefully help those individuals with that information to take action and potentially provide some guidance. And that in itself was hopefully a quick whistle-stop tour that shows you from high-level specificity on the topic, how do you interact with data, and how do you create deliverable in minutes rather than days or hours with AlphaSense. Any questions? Yes?
So I think it's a very good function, but one question is, when you combine different files into the AI focused analysis, so can the PPT file also be analyzed and then conduct some summaries? Because sometimes companies report with PPT with some charts, with pie charts and column charts. Can this also be read and also be summarized?
So the question is, can AlphaSense at this point in time interpret graphics? And right now, no. Right now it's text. But I mean, I've been with the company close to 3 years, and things we can do now versus what we used to be able to do 3 years ago is significantly different. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is part of the roadmap, but right now, no. But it's a very good question, and I think the other part of the question was, can you take information from the organization, such as presentations, and ingest them into AlphaSense? And the answer is yes, you can.
I do think combine the files and with summary is really saving time. Because when you check the competitor information, you need a lot of time reading reports and compare different reports
Yeah. So the way that we think about this at AlphaSense, let me just go back a few steps here, is that you can essentially, now I actually had a sort of backup version of a report that I've uploaded, but essentially you can select your own documents and connect this with your SharePoint or Box or Google Maps, or Google Drive, sorry, it's early, and bring in your own folders, your own files, but also your organization's files and folders to be part of the discussion. So I actually have a few documents that I've created in the past saying, what is the total addressable market for robo-taxis in Berlin? And you can also be quite deliberate and say, right, I just want my internal sources to be the source of information for this answer. But you can also just make it a little bit easier and say, what is our internal view of the TAM for robo-taxis? And that will tell AlphaSense, right, this guy wants to understand this question, but he also thinks that the answer lies within the organization already, and we can leverage that. And here's just one example of something that, by the way, I created this document myself just to make a point here, but it basically pulls from tables, and this is something that wasn't in the external database of AlphaSense, but something that is internal. No, but a really good question, thank you. We still haven't, well, we've actually overrun by a minute, my apologies, but if you have any more questions, be more than happy to chat with you guys at the booth, and thank you for your attendance.